when I was an art student, uh, I wanted to take, there was a teacher at the Maryland Institute that I didn't know anything about except all the really good painters wanted to take his class. Didn't know anything about the guy. So there was a what they call an intersession between January and December. You had this break. So I wanted to take a class, and he was teaching a figure painting class, and that's what I wanted to take. So the registrar said, "You can't take that class. It's restricted to juniors." And I said, "Well, I want to take." She said, "You can't." She said, "Go talk to the teacher, but you can't." So I find the teacher. And I said, I want to take this class. He said, well, it's for juniors. And I said, I really want to take the class. So he said, all right, look, bring me a couple of paintings. I'll look at your paintings and then I'll tell you whether I'll let you take the class. So I ran out of the building. I went to my apartment. I came right back. I was back in less than 20 minutes. And I said, here's my paintings. He looks at me, painting, says, all right, I'll let you in the class. So I'm the only freshman in this class, a junior level class. I show up at the class. And there were 12 people in the class, and they were really more mature in every regard than I was. And what the guy was an interesting teacher, and he made a very interesting premise for what we were supposed to do. And I didn't know anything about him. I just knew everybody thought he was great. Well, it turns out, in retrospect, he was Richard Diebenkorn's star student. And when he was 24 years old, he was in a show at the Museum of Modern Art. And John Cannaday reviewed the show and called him the single best painter of his at that time in the show. And so anyway, there was this guy in my class there who was painting, and he made these really nice little paintings very fluidly, very abstractly. And he comes in and he had this paint box that I had never seen the likes of. And I'm completely fascinated. Every time there's a break, I'm talking to him about the paint box. So he tells me where he got it. So on lunch break, I run to that store to see this paint box. They told me it would cost $84. Well, $84 was a lot of money, and I didn't have it. So I came back and I had a new idea. I said, I spent the next 4 hours trying to convince this guy to let me borrow the box for 3 days. And finally, I don't know how I talked him into it, but he said, okay, I'll let you do it. So I took his box without anything in it, and I drove back to Philadelphia where my father, who was a trained cabinet maker, was. And I showed him the paint box and I said, I need you to copy this box and I need to have it done in 2 days. And he looks, he says, well, I have to go get I said, I don't give a what kind of wood you use. I want one of these. Make it out of anything you can find, but make me one of these. And he said, all right. So he put me one together and I drive back and now I've got my box and I got his box. And so I'm using it. And after about 6 weeks, I come back to my father and I said, there's a whole bunch of little things we got to make differently here. So this was what they call a French easel box. It opens up and it has an easel built into it, a drawer and all this stuff. So I made some modifications in what I thought would make it better for an American artist as opposed to a French artist then. So my father made this box according to the specifications that I gave him. So I'm using this box, and other artists are asking me about the box. So I said to my father, I said, could you make more of those boxes? I can sell them, I think. So I'm selling these boxes for 75 bucks. So pretty soon, like people like Neil Welliver have one, Fairfield Porter, I mean, some of the great painters, Paul Georges, etc. So anyway, other art students are buying them. And so several years later, a friend of mine is getting married and he's friends with Arthur Miller. So the wedding is going to take place at Arthur Miller's place in Connecticut. So I'm in the wedding party. So we get invited to go up there. So we're playing cards, drinking whiskey, smoking cigars with Sloane Coffin, Arthur Miller, a bunch of, the 70s kind of, intellectuals. And the next day, Arthur comes over to me and he says, I understand you're responsible for that paint box. I said, the paint box? He said, yeah, the paint box. I said, oh, well, not really. I said, my father made the box. I said, I had something to do with so anyway, turns out that Arthur Miller was an amateur carpenter, and his daughter, Rebecca, the filmmaker, had been a student at Yale, and a friend of mine had one of these paint boxes, and she got that paint box and brought it home to Arthur, and Arthur took it apart and copied my father's box and made one for her. Right. So now he takes my wife and I aside, and for 2 hours, we're sitting in his study as he's telling these great stories of writing movies in Hollywood and Marilyn Monroe and all this stuff. Is really pretty cool. So as he's talking, I noticed behind him on the wall, there's a drawing that looks like him. And I said, "Is that a drawing of you?" He says, "Yeah." He said, "Would you like to hear the story?" I said, "Sure." He says, "Well," he said, "we were all out here, Marilyn, Stuart Widmark, and he said, and Sandy Calder." And he said, so we're drinking for hours. Everybody was totally trashed. So he says, so I said to Calder, I said, Calder, you're so fucked up you couldn't even draw a straight line. Calder says, it doesn't matter how much I drink, I can always draw. He said, nah, you can't. So he said, we argued back and forth. So finally I said, prove it. He says, what do you want me to draw? I said, draw me. He says, where? He said, right here. So he says, with what? He says, here. And he gives him a marker. So Calder draws Arthur Miller on the wall. He says, I told you I could do it. He says, sign it. So he signs it. So he said, the next morning I come out here, hungover, and I cut that piece of sheetrock out of the wall and I drove into town and I had it framed and I had the wall patched. And then I came back and it's been hanging on that wall ever since, just where he drew it. And I said, I bet not a lot of people have ever heard that story, but I got there through that paint box that I got from that class. So anyway, I tell that story to the teacher because that teacher became a friend of mine. We stayed friends until he died. In fact, I gave the eulogy at his death. And I had come to his house in Baltimore and we're sitting in his living room, drinking wine, talking, and he's he's telling this story of studying with Diebenkorn. And he said, I was so excited. The great artist Diebenkorn, and I'm in his class. So he said, I'm in his class and I'm painting. And he's walking around, he's looking at my painting, he's talking to the students. He didn't say a word to me. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. He's not a word. So now he says, I'm talking to people. I said, that Diebenkorn, he's not so hot. He's not what he's cracked up to be. He says, I'm trashing the guy because he's not paying attention to me. He says, so I'm standing out on the green at the college. And he said, I hear my name being called. And I turn and I look, and there's Diebenkorn across the green calling, telling me to come over. And he said, Jim, sit down. Let's talk about your painting. And he said he sat down and he told me more about my painting than I knew myself. And he said, so I'm feeling so bad because here I've been trashing the guy, and here he's been really paying attention to me. And I said, well, I'll tell you something, Jim. I said, that's funny because I remember that class that I got into that you let me in. It was only for juniors. He said, yeah. I said, I'm in that class. And it was first day. You walk around, you're talking to everybody, smoking your Pell-Mell cigarettes, talking, telling these wonderful stories. You get behind me, just stand behind me, not a word. And I figure he must really can see that I'm really a crappy artist. I'm not any good. So he kept walking around. Second day, not a word. Third day, not a word. Fourth day, I said, we got one more day with this pose, and he still hasn't said a damn thing to me. So I'm working on the painting. So finally, he's standing behind me, and I said, I think he's going to move. I said, could I ask you a question? He said, sure. And I said, come over. I want to show you what I mean. So I said, I've been working on this painting and I can't get the hand right. I got this one okay, but this one doesn't make sense to me. I tried this, I tried that. I said, can you give me a clue? Any clue what I'm not seeing, what I'm missing? So he looks at my painting. He scratches his beard, takes a big puff from his cigarette, and there's a big cloud of smoke around me. He said, hands and feet are hard as shit to paint. And then he walked away. And I felt like I was in. I made it. I had become a brother. He was talking to me like an artist. And then, uh, I tell him this story. As I tell him the story, he says, wait. He gets up and he disappears and he comes back. Here he had a drawing made from exactly the same view that I was painting. He's standing behind me working on a drawing while I'm working on that painting. And here he has this drawing, and then he says, let's trade. So he traded me a drawing for that drawing. And that's full circle story that I thought was really pretty interesting.